And we turn immediately to our second speaker, Professor ציון עראקי Clorman from the Department of Philosophy, History and Judaic Studies here at the Open University. Professor עראקי Clorman will talk about polygamous practices, Muslim families and Jewish families in Yemen and in Palestine. Please.
Thank you, Ophir. Polygamy. Polygamy has been practiced for centuries in many societies, among them in Muslim and Jewish communities. Following the ban on polygamy imposed by Rabbi Gershon at the beginning of the 11th century, it ceased in Ashkenaz but continued in other Jewish communities. However, following the impact of 19th century Western colonialism, Jewish polygamy became a rare phenomenon and almost disappeared. Nonetheless, the Jewish community of Yemen, remaining outside direct influence of Western powers, retained its tradition of plural marriage even after immigrating to Palestine in the 19th and the 20th century. Jewish polygamy in Yemen existed within a supportive cultural space and corresponded with a similar practice in the Muslim surrounding. In the middle of the 20th century, between 6 to 14% of Muslim men maintained polygamous families. I'm saying between 6 to 14, depending on the region. That's more or less. There are several studies which depict some places 6%, some places 10% approximately, and some places even as high as 14%. This usage of polygamous marriage was more common among the wealthy Muslim men. It is assumed that in the Jewish community, polygamy was somewhat less prevalent than in the Muslim society. Plural marriages among Jews and Muslims were sometimes politically motivated and also expressed the man's wishes for more children or stemmed from his desire for a younger woman. In addition, in both Jewish and Muslim families, when the first wife did not bear children, the husband would marry a second wife. As procreation is considered an important commandment in Judaism, if a woman did not bear children for 10 years of marriage, Jewish law recommends forcing the husband to divorce her. This commandment can also be fulfilled by marrying a second wife. Plural marriages would also happen when the first wife gave birth to one child only or when her children died in infancy, sometimes even when she had only girls. These conditions were perceived as a secondary barrenness. Polygamy in these circumstances was often presented in Yemeni society, both Muslim and Jewish, as sort of amulet to guarantee that the first wife's children would survive. Plural marriages were also caused by levirate laws. Jewish law requires a man to marry his brother's widow if he died without having children. Although the widow could be released from the levirate marriage by chalitza ceremony, of which we heard previously in the previous talk, the Yemeni Jewish tradition maintained that the levirate commandment had a priority, and its rabbis hardly ever allowed chalitza. Yemeni Jews strove to adhere to the levirate commandment even after immigrating to Palestine. It should be noted in Palestine that, as in other places, polygamous marriages occurred also among Ashkenazi or Sephardi Jews, mostly in the context of immigration, when men left their wives in the homeland and in the new country married another woman. But the legal system of the Yemeni Jews was the only one to consistently back polygamy on halachic and traditional grounds. Following immigration, the rate of new polygamous marriages among the Yemeni community decreased considerably, but the practice did not cease. In Palestine, with the encounter of codes of a modern society, the patriarchal Yemeni Jewish community was pushed to make substantial modifications in both their collective communal perceptions and in the private sphere of the family. The family's daily routine underwent changes in respect to issues such as power relations and dependency within the patriarchal structure, hierarchy within the family, and Jewish women's rights. These changes pertained firstly to the transformation in the status of women and their role in the family, and involved the weakening of the institution of polygamy. It seems pertinent to note that in spite of the difference in family practices between Yemen and Jewish Palestine, Jewish women in Yemen were not totally dependent on men. In Palestine, these women took advantage of the new legal and social circumstances and endeavored to apply them to their own behalf. Once in Palestine, they worked mostly as domestics, often earning much more than men. Through their economic activities and their participation in social activities organized by women's associations, they met with men and women of other more modernized ethnic groups and became well informed. The rest of my presentation will touch upon developments which led to the diminishing of the custom of polygamy among Yemeni Jewish community. It will also point at the internal debates around tradition and modernity that this transition provoked, and to the historical and social context of its happening. Subsequent to Rabbi Gershon's ruling, Ashkenazi legal tradition formulated a stipulation which was inserted as a clause to the Ketubah and stated that a specific man undertook not to marry another woman during his wife's lifetime. With the wide acceptance in Ashkenaz of the ban of polygamy, this clause was often omitted from the Ketubot. However, in the Sephardic communities, since the middle of the 19th century, this clause was added commonly to the Ketubot. Such a clause was never to be found in Ketubot written in Yemen. No, even one Ketubah, we don't find such a restriction that a man agrees to not to marry another woman. But once in Palestine, many women became knowledgeable of this legal practice. Consequently, after only 3 or 4 years in Palestine, brides demanded that a similar clause be added in their marriage agreements. Thus, in quite a few Yemeni Jewish engagement agreements and Ketubot from the 20s, 30s, and the 40s, which I examined, such clause was affixed. The embracing in Palestine of this Sephardic legal usage enabled women to depart from the prevalence of the Yemeni Jewish legal system and to escape the possibility of having a tzara, a second wife. Women's obvious gendered resentment for polygamy found support and encouragement in the general Jewish society in Palestine. The custom of plural marriage was met with both amazement and affront and awakened some Yishuv activists to impose their views on the Yemeni Jews in order to eliminate this phenomenon or at least to hinder new polygamous marriages. For example, in the town of Rishon LeZion, 1914, the colony's managing committee pleaded to the rabbinic court in Jaffa to summon a certain person who had married a second wife to force him to divorce one of his wives. In addition, it warned the polygamist that if his disobedience continued, he would not be provided with work. As these calls lacked any legal backing or power of enforcement, they had no immediate effect and resulted mostly in applying social pressure on the Yemeni Jews. It seems, however, that it was the polygamous marriage of Yemeni Jewish activist Abraham Tabib in 1933 that augmented the opposition to the custom of plural marriage and helped to undermine this institution in Jewish Palestine. This marriage drew a great deal of attention in the Yishuv, attracted much criticism by women's organizations, and was even covered by the foreign press. And in the New York Times, I found a notice about what happened in Palestine, about this specific person, Abraham Tabib. Tabib, who immigrated to Palestine in 1909, stood out as a prominent leader. He developed close working relations with the Yishuv leading figures, and in 1920 he was elected to the first elected assembly, and between 1924 to 1944 served as a deputy chair of the Yemeni Union in Palestine as its representative in the Zionist executive committees and in Zionist congresses. Tabib married his first wife, Sarah, in Yemen, 1904, but after more than 20 years of marriage, in the pretext of that Sarah was sick, he searched and found a young woman, and in 1930, he prepared to marry her. But Sarah contested his plan and refused to divorce him. Because he was a public figure, Tabib's conduct in his private life could not go unnoticed, especially since Sarah fought his plans and used all means available to her. It seems that from the very beginning she was assisted by the Association of Hebrew Women for Equal Rights, which followed the Tabib case and excited public opinion against his polygamy and polygamist marriages in general. Initially, Sarah appealed to the chief rabbinate in Tel Aviv, demanding to forbid Abraham to go forward with his intentions. She claimed that her medical condition was improving and that there was no legal pretext for him to marry a second wife. The rabbis accepted Sarah's argument and told Tabib that he could not ask to divorce her or marry a second wife. When Tabib announced his refusal to obey, Sarah appealed to the chief rabbinate court in Jerusalem, which endorsed the Tel Aviv judgment. In September 32, Tabib appealed to the Sephardic chief rabbi, Rabbi Jacob Meir, asked him to review his case, disregarding Rabbi Gershom ban, saying that it did not apply to the Mizrahi and the Yemeni communities. But when his plea was rejected, Tabib ignored the court and in early 33 married a second wife. Following the Tabib case, as well as the trial in March 1931 of Alexander Lubling, an immigrant from Poland, who after submitting a false document that he was single and married a second woman, polygamous marriage became one of the major issues on the agenda of Association of Hebrew Women. In early 1933, it called the chief rabbinate that the rabbis used their influence so that members of the Mizrahi communities would accept Rabbi Gershom's ban. The association consistent arguments and activities, which were really initiated specifically after the Tabib case, these were very valuable in encouraging Rabbi Isaac Herzog, Yitzhak Herzog, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Palestine, grandfather of Bougie Herzog, to take steps towards curtailing polygamy. It also helped to keep this issue alive in public discourse and to create a negative perception of plural marriage in the Jewish public in general and in the Yemeni community in particular. A major setback to the institution of polygamy came about with the intervention of the state, that is of British colonialism, which found collaboration in the chief rabbinate of Palestine. Following the 37 acquittal in Jewish court of a certain Yaakov Melnik, an Ashkenazi Jew who had married 3 women without divorcing any of them, the chief rabbis became involved in amending Article 181 of the Penal Law regarding prohibiting bigamy. Their proposed version was accepted by the British and in 1945 was published as the proposed official law, and later it became the foundation of Israel bigamy law. Not surprisingly, these developments were met with opposition by the Yemeni Jewish men, of whom one of the most outspoken was Abraham Tabib. Since the beginning of 1939, Yemeni Union in Palestine and the Religious Council of Yemeni Jews waged a campaign against prohibiting plural marriage by state law, saying that this prohibition was against Jewish law and against centuries-old tradition of the Yemeni Jewish community. They wrote numerous letters to the Chief Rabbi Isaac Herzog and petitioned to the High Commissioner Harold McMichael. When the final amendment to Article 181 of the Penal Law was published in September 1946, once again, Yemeni male leaders sent angry letters of protest to the High Commissioner. The old guard attempts to combat the legal prohibition of polygamy and to preserve it, at least in their own community, were unsuccessful. Furthermore, during the 30s and 40s, polygamy became less acceptable to greater sectors of the Yemeni Jewish community and less tolerable to the non-Yemeni public. Yet the custom did not disappear, and newcomers from Yemen constantly gave it new validation. Following the establishment of the State of Israel and the Great Immigration of 1949-1950, polygamous families arrived in Israel, and there occurred a number of new such marriages. Sporadic plural marriages happened in Israel, even as late as the 70s and the 80s. During all this period of time, the Jews who remained in Yemen, much like their Muslim surrounding, have continued the practice of polygamy. During the 1990s, a few hundreds of the last Jews of Yemen immigrated to Palestine, to Israel. 90s Israel, of course. Among them, some polygamous families. And nowadays, as you can imagine, there are still a number of polygamous families living in Jewish Israel, most of which were created in Yemen, either before 1950 or thereafter. In conclusion, the ultimate elimination of polygamy represents the clash between traditional and modern family values, which promoted a significant transition in the status of women and caused changes in the dynamics of the Yemeni Jewish family. These changes resulted from the direct impact of outside colonial factors, that is, the British rule and legislation, the numbers of issues, even in matters of inheritance. Today I spoke about bigamy. A second factor is the internal colonial factors, which are pressures from the dominant Yishuv society, which were mostly a byproduct of the colonial impact. And also resistance from within the Yemeni community, mainly by women. And fourthly, the ability of Israel's judicial system to enforce the bigamy law on its Jewish citizens, which itself was sustained by the first three factors that I mentioned. However, I would say in parentheses, the state is reluctant to impose the law on its Muslim citizens, mainly the Bedouins, and many of us here do know that the custom of polygamy is still alive and kicking, especially in the southern Israel among the Bedouin society. Nevertheless, the transitions of family values, which I've mentioned earlier, could happen only among the Yemeni Jewish community, only in the post-immigration situation, the modernized society of Jewish Palestine, and then Israel. And it could not happen in the Muslim Yemeni political and social circumstances, which are still accepting polygamy as a normative lifestyle. Thank you. כן, אני חושבת, שאלה מעניינת מאוד, הרבה נשים וגברים. אני רוצה לומר לך שהמינוח שאני משתמשת אולי לא מדויק, כי פוליגמיה מתכוונת לריבוי של נישואים של גבר עם כמה נשים או אישה עם כמה גברים, או יותר מגבר אחד. המונח המדויק הוא פוליגני. אנחנו משתמשים, פוליגני זה המונח המדויק לתאר גבר עם יותר מאישה אחת. אבל מכיוון שהמונח הוא פוליגמי, הוא יותר פופולר, או יותר מובן, אני בחרתי להשתמש בו. אנחנו לא מוצאים את זה כל כך הרבה בחברות שאנחנו מכירים מקרוב.
You said the Association of Hebrew Women for Women's Rights called on the chief rabbinate to support Gershom's ban, which created a negative perception of plural marriage in public, meaning the general Israeli public. And you said, and in the Yemeni community in particular. So I'm wondering if there's a gender breakdown. In other words, it seems to me that it's not just Yemeni women who oppose plural marriage, right? And thinking of male support, in other words, male support for women's rights. So when you say in the Yemeni community in particular, was there a gender breakdown? Were there more women who would have supported Gershom's ban?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, we can see really, you describe it as a gender distinction. Definitely women, from a gender point of view, resisted polygamy. It's very natural. We can understand it. And the legal and social circumstances in Palestine gave them power to resist their community and the male community. And this is one of the reasons that I found helped to diminish the phenomenon of polygamy among Yemeni Jews in Israel and informally in Palestine. It's definitely so. But we can see the distinction between men who fought against this change of norms, of family's lifestyle. Definitely we are, the petitions, they went in all kinds of Yemeni settlements, and men and community leaders and rabbis signed the petitions that they sent all over. But women definitely were against it, and women were encouraged to oppose polygamy by practicing, by resisting, by demanding that in their ketubah there would be added a clause that says that I take upon myself not to marry another wife as long as my wife is alive. And they demanded it. And another thing is they participating in activities of women's organizations that were waging a war against plural marriage. That's definitely we can see a distinctive gender shift and rift between the two genders. Definitely so.
This is on the margin of your talk, but I wonder whether you're aware of instances in which Muslim women appeal to Israeli courts in order to avoid.
You mean about to the state law?
Yes.
To the state law.
You mentioned that the state of Israel is reluctant to impose the law on Muslim, perhaps better in society.
Well, this is a very delicate and difficult question to answer, and it's very hard because we know what's going on today, that women officially are not registered. Are not registered, and usually what happens that men today nowadays tell the state that they divorced their wife, okay, and then they can register their second wife, so they can have all kinds of social benefits still in the family, the income coming to the family. And according to Muslim law, it's okay. According to Jewish law, it's okay. Okay, the change is state law, but it's not religious law, because according to religious law, there's no second wife, third wife. It's valid. You cannot. It's not annulled. It's this kind of. But the question of women are appealing to the state law, I never heard of it, because still the pressures of the community are so hard and tough. And they have their chains, which. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, no.
I have a question for you, but first, just perhaps a brief response to your question. There are quite many. It's not rare that Muslim women appeal to civil courts for compensation for polygamous marriage. It's actually it's quite common, but there is at least several cases every year. So that is it does happen. I wanted to ask something about, perhaps a little bit on the periphery of your lecture. You said in the beginning of your talk that except for the Yemenite community, in other countries, polygamous marriage among Jews became very rare because of colonialism. And I wondered if you can elaborate a little bit with perhaps some countries like Iraq, Egypt, or the Middle East. Were there no polygamous marriage among Jews? And if so, how is it related to colonialism? Because colonialism hasn't prohibited polygamous marriages in this country.
No, definitely did not. But definitely, but social pressures and cultural impact, which is very, very important. In North Africa, we know that the French were there. In Algeria, for example, since 1830. And they had influence before conquering physically the other parts of North Africa. They were very influential culturally and socially. And this affected the Jewish community immensely. They established, the Jewish community, the Kiach, for example, the Alliance, established a network of schooling for Jewish children, boys and girls. So the traditions and the cultural influences were very, very strong. In the same way, we can see it both in Iraq, that you mentioned, and in Turkey, and definitely in Egypt, which was a very cosmopolitan society, with a lot of influence of Italians and British and German and French, and the Jewish community was very much part of this cosmopolitan society, and we see these influences all over. But Yemen is very different because it was never under direct colonial occupation. Never. And these changes, when I'm speaking in Hebrew, in English, because you asked in English, maybe. Anyway, these changes were coming, never reached there. Okay? It's okay.
English or Hebrew?
Whatever you pick.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I want to ask about if you see any connections between the reactions to polygamy and the resistance of the community to patterns of community endogamy. And it's interesting not only in Yemen, where I can maybe predict the answer, but also after immigration to mandatory Palestine, or even in 49 and 50. Is there, so my question is there any connections between the wish to keep the woman inside the community and the polygamy?
I don't see it in Yemen, okay, because this was standard accepted usage. And not in Palestine or in Israel, later when women went out of the house to work elsewhere. And as I mentioned, sometimes they were the major breadwinner of the family. And because they went out and they had the power, they had the power of the economic power in their hands, they could also resist their men. Many women went out and were working and earning money when they were single before, and they could ask and they could demand what to be written in their ketubot. So this is different, and I would also definitely different from Yemen, but even in Yemen, women in the rural area, which were the majority of the Yemeni Jewish community, went out and they were not enclosed in the house. They were not enclosed like in the cities, like in the towns, and we know that women are kept in-house. But in the tribal and the village, rural areas, they are much more out there.
Thank you. One last comment.
רק הערה למשפט האחרון שלך. עדן ותימן, שהן שתי קהילות יהודיות סמוכות זו לזו. היום אין יהודים בעדן. אבל משום שעדן הייתה קולוניה בריטית, אכן שם התקבל חרם דרבנו גרשום, ושם לא נסעו יותר מאישה.
Okay, Aden was under British rule since 1839, and all which is related to British colonialism in Aden. So it was different. It developed different. It developed differently, definitely.